Sam Hughes, like a lot of Ontario Protestants of his day, was in fact cold, sober temperance. You may think some of his behavior could only be explained by booze, but no, he was dry. He had to do it on his own. He also understood that most of the women of Canada, at least of his acquaintance, were dry too, and they wouldn't have let their boy join the army if they thought he was going to become a boozer. After all, it was a serious problem at the time. So this was a cold water army, so far as Sam could make it so. And doing that in Britain, as you can testify, ain't easy.
The situation did improve once the sale of beer was approved in camp, but these two particular soldiers had been out probably celebrating Christmas just coming up and so on, came back, had caused a ruckus in the local town and had been put in jankers for Christmas Day. And so the story goes, John McCrae, as their medical officer, had probably sort of thought, ah, well, they've learnt their lesson, but we can't have these two, you know, not having some sort of Christmas cheer. So as the story goes, he sent each of them a small brown bottle labelled, you know, to be taken with meals, and it turned out it was an issue of rum, which he was able to do at his discretion, which I thought was rather a nice touch for Christmas.
The Canadian medical staff soon discovered that their troops were finding more than the occasional hangover on their trips into the local and beautiful countryside. Of the 4,000 Canadian hospital visits on the Salisbury Plains over the winter of 1914 and 15, nearly 2,000 of them would be for treatment of venereal disease. Whether they had brought it in with them or had caught it in these picturesque English villages was a matter of constant debate.
Well, there's an argument, of course, across the Atlantic. Did these lads take some over with them, or was it entirely acquired in Great Britain? And Canadian nationalists have been arguing that one ever since. Canadian women were all pure, or no, Canadian women had their fair share. And certainly Canadian men had whatever old Adam it took. Canadians would, throughout the war, among other things, not perhaps the most important event of the war, acquire a championship in venereal disease rate. Even the Australians couldn't match us.
Modern-day troops still train where the Canadians suffered through the wettest and most miserable winter in memory. The Salisbury Plains, early in 1915, had been turned into a mud bath, and Ottawa demanded that their troops be moved out of the leaking tents and into the wooden huts the British had originally promised. When the huts were built, they had little, if any, ventilation and became an instant breeding ground for disease. Suddenly, John McCrae had an epidemic on his hands as 39 boys came down with meningitis. 28 of them died, the first major Canadian casualties of the war effort. In the small and pretty English town of Devizes, the local Bear Hotel became the Canadian officers' mess and headquarters while they waited to go to the front. And it was here that McCrae and the other officers would learn of the carnage, which became known as the First Battle of Ypres.
First Battle of Ypres had been the death of the British Regular Army, and that had made the soil of Ypres sacred to British generals, many of whom had lost their own son at that battle. So Ypres was very valuable territory emotionally to the British High Command and to many senior British officers. It was also the last corner of free Belgium. Oddly enough, it was populated by people who were not very fond of the Belgian regime. They were Belgian Flemish. But nonetheless, to the Allies, it was important to keep a corner of Belgium. To the British generals who'd lost their sons, it was important to keep that sacred soil from the Germans. So it's symbolic ground.
They were finally moved out in March 1915 and assigned to that symbolic ground near the town of Ypres. On April 20th, a group of local children had been playing in the market square while their parents debated whether they should move further behind the Allied lines. Without warning, a German shell exploded and killed 15 of the children. The Second Battle of Ypres had begun. German prisoners of war had confessed that canisters of poison gas had been stockpiled near the front lines. The evidence was irrefutable. But amazingly, the information was dismissed. The British High Command simply refused to believe such barbarism was possible.
There were signs that a gas attack was being prepared, but who would believe them? The Germans, after all, might be denounced in propaganda as hideous, fiendish Huns, but in reality they were a civilized European army that had promised not to do this. So let's not take these excitable accounts too seriously. If you believed all the excitable accounts generals got, they wouldn't have done anything. And this was just one more rumor.
When the Germans opened up more than 5,000 canisters of chlorine gas, they'd waited for conditions to be right, which they were, late afternoon on the 22nd of April 1915. The gas had been pumped in under force, so it spurted out with quite a force. It was carried on the breeze once it had sort of reached about 100 yards from where the canisters were and started to drift towards the Allied lines. It affected the French troops first and probably worst of all, although the Canadians were also badly affected. But it was such a shock, and it was so awful, the suffering and the shock, that the line broke. And the Canadians found themselves in a terrible position.
What happened next? The Germans themselves are astonished. They never imagined it would be that easy. They were accustomed to the kinds of hard, slogging, merciless, hugely expensive attacks on the Western Front. Suddenly, the enemy had vanished. It must be a trick. Stop! Wait! Let's see what's going to happen next. Which was the salvation of the Canadians, because if the Germans had really been planning a major success, they would have swept around the Canadians, and 20,000 Canadians would have found themselves rapidly dead or prisoners of war.
The end result of all this was, by the time the division was withdrawn, of a division of 20,000 men, more than 6,000 had been killed, wounded, or posted missing. And this, this was a terrible shock for the Dominion. It was a very terrible battle, and the first, of course, the first gas attack in the history of warfare.
Fortunately, the Canadians had some expertise. A small unit had been formed for chemical analysis, basically to protect the water supply. But the chemist involved, Colonel Naismith, who was a University of Toronto professor, knew a lot about chemistry and knew a lot about chemical medical problems. And he was the one who seems to have given the advice that if the soldiers will urinate into a piece of their handkerchief or maybe a bandage of some kind, hold it over their nose, the urine will be some protection against chlorine. Whether or not it was, and it's some use against it. Chemically, it was good use morally. At least you had something you could do. Maybe pretty nauseous if you think about it, but at least this was something you could do rather than just stand there and wait for it.
As John McCrae said, he himself described it as 17 days of Hades. The medical officers said it was like a nightmare, like working the seventh hell of the damned. It's impossible to imagine what it must have been like.
For 17 days and 17 nights, none of us have had our clothes off, except occasionally for a change of socks. In all that time, while I was awake, gunfire and rifle fire never ceased for 60 seconds. Our casualties are half the men on the firing line. My clothes, boots, kit, and dugout at various times were sadly bloody. There is the constant background of the sight of the dead, the wounded, the maimed. None of our men went off their heads, but men in nearby units did, and no wonder. How tired we are, weary in body and wearier in mind. And all the time, the birds sing over our heads.
McCrae's involvement is with a field ambulance, which is partly collecting wounded and partly giving them their first treatment as casualties. And frankly, he is engaged mainly with traditional casualties, the wounded from shell fire and from bullets. And shell fire wounds greatly outnumber bullet wounds, and they are terrible. Nobody can be prepared for them in medical school. I mean, a shell wound is simply a piece of white-hot metal that hits your body somewhere. And it will kill you very often, or it'll tear off great hunks of flesh, leaving bones exposed. I mean, I don't want to get too graphic, but realize that's what the medical corps is basically there trying to cope with. And really appalling wounds, disgusting, the sort of thing that would keep a modern-day emergency ward fully engaged on one case. And here they're coming in twos, tens, dozens, 50s.
Every day on the Western Front, 7,000 British troops were killed or wounded. It's unbelievable numbers there. And that was just on a normal day. That was nothing to do with a major battle.
The fields of Flanders had been heavily manured for centuries, and when the men fell with open wounds into the soil, the bacteria there would cause terrible infections. Amputation seemed the only solution. Still standing near the town of Ypres are the bunkers that once served as his makeshift field hospital. And it was here, as the battle raged, that John McCrae was about to write the poem which would capture for all time the terrible essence of the war in Flanders.
Been hunting around for meal ideas? Start with cheese and your meals will evolve. When you've got cheese, you've got choice.
Occasionally you'll get somebody calling to file a claim, and they call through to our department, and we're the first people that actually talk to them, and they're very, very emotional, and that can be very difficult. But on the whole, it's not like that. They're looking for advice. They're looking for maybe a little bit of encouragement. We just basically suggest we listen. Insurance is a tough enough subject for people to talk about. We don't need to make it more difficult. We try to make the best of the situation and lighten it up a little bit so that the client leaves that whole situation in a good frame of mind.
Last night, my husband overcooked the rice. We're talking bullets.
Blue cheese omelet. No butter. Think about it. Lasagna, 400 degrees. Guess who took a nap?
Sunlight. Dish it out. We can take it.
Leslie Nielsen here with sound advice on how to play the new Scratch and Win Battleship. Scratch a submarine, make this sound. Auga, auga, win $100. Whoop, whoop, whoop. That's a battleship worth $5,000. Scratch a carrier and whoosh, $25,000.
Mr. Nielsen, what happens when you scratch a mine?
I'll just scratch my own if you don't mind.
Scratch and Win Battleship. You could win up to $25,000 instantly.
What ship is that?
Potato chip.
Not on the list.
What do you see?
Just a bunch of stuff.
A brother label maker. I could use that. All right, a brother fax. Oh, a brother printer. A water gun.
Busted.
Get Brother products at a guaranteed low price and over 7,000 other great gift ideas at Staples, your Christmas gift headquarters.
At the Bear Hotel in Devizes, just before being moved to the front, the Canadian officers of the 1st Field Artillery had posed for their official photograph. McCrae was on the left. In the middle, in the top row, stood 22-year-old Lieutenant Alexis Helmer. Helmer had been a student at McGill while McCrae taught there, and had also been raised in the tradition of the Canadian militia. John McCrae and the young officer had a lot in common.
They did move in the same social circles, same strata of society. But Helmer, I think, would very much have looked up to Dr. McCrae, as he would have thought of him, or Professor McCrae, and would have felt that he was definitely being singled out and flattered by becoming closer, becoming friendly with John McCrae.
Lex Helmer was engaged to be married, and he carried a photograph of his fiancée with him. He had the picture in his pocket when he made his way to his battery position here by the Yser Canal, just a short distance from McCrae's overworked field hospital. It was early in the morning of the 2nd of May, and Lex Helmer was about to die.
The 2nd of May was a bad day. They